Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Deputy Managing Editor, Los Angeles Times, Megan Garvey.
Good morning, welcome. I hope you guys are enjoying Los Angeles. It's my city and I love it, so. When Jane asked me if I would introduce this panel, I said, of course, it's such an important topic for anyone working in journalism online today, or really anyone who wants to participate in the conversation. The reality is that harassment or even threats to journalists have been going on a long time. I'm pretty sure I have some printed letters in a file somewhere I'd still find pretty startling. But the nature of the internet has really changed things. It's made it possible for people to attack you or go after you in a really public way. Before we get started, I just wanted to caution everyone that this is a difficult topic, and it's one that's going to likely use words and cover areas that might make you uncomfortable or even upset. If you feel the need, please feel free to stand up and leave the room. Now, it's really my pleasure to introduce the moderator for this panel, Sarah Zhang. She's contributing editor of Vice Motherboard. She's a journalist who trained as a lawyer and the author of the book, The Internet of Garbage.
Thank you, Megan. On the panel here today, we have Amanda Hess, who's a staff writer at Slate and a contributor to the New York Times Magazine. Her Pacific Standard essay on gendered online harassment, Women Aren't Welcome on the Internet, won the 2015 National Magazine Award for the Public Interest. Then to her right, we have Soraya Shamali, who is the director of the Speech Project at the Women's Media Center. She's an award-winning feminist writer, media critic, and activist whose work focuses on women's rights and the role of gender in politics, religion, and popular culture. She was one of the primary organizers of a huge social media campaign demanding that Facebook recognize misogynistic content as hate speech. And then to her right, we have Dr. Michelle Ferrier, who is the Associate Dean of Innovation, Research, Creative Activity, and Graduate Studies for Ohio University. She's a former columnist, a digital content architect, and an online community developer who's been involved in new media for more than 30 years, and she is also the founder of Trollbusters, an initiative that we'll be talking about today. And finally, we have Lori Penny, who's an author and journalist. She writes for the New Statesman and is a Berkman Fellow at Harvard University. Her latest book, Unspeakable Things, is published by Bloomsbury. So before we start, I think it's important that we address sort of the underlying numbers behind this problem. There aren't a lot of studies that deal specifically with journalists, but we can talk about people in general. The US National Violence Against Women Survey estimates that 60% of cyberstalking victims are women. The National Center for the Victims of Crimes puts that estimate at 70%. The Bureau of Justice Statistics reports that 74% of individuals stalked both online or offline are female. From 1996 to 2000, the majority of the NYPD Computer Investigation and Technology Unit found that their aggravated cyber harassment victims, the vast majority were female. And this, I think, is one of the most telling studies. In 2006, researchers put bots on IRC. These bots were entirely silent, but the ones with the female names received 25 times more malicious private messages than the bots with the male names. A 2009 study of undergraduates found that non-white females faced cyber harassment more than any other group, with 53% reporting having been harassed online. Next were white females at 45%, and non-white males at 31%. I think it's important that we will be talking about gendered violence here today, but we're not able to extricate it from the social context in which race, sexuality, and gender identity are also implicated. So before we start talking about the harassment of female journalists and what to do about it, I think we should start from the beginning. What do we mean by harassment? Is it just a torrent of words? Is it threats? Is it imminent threats? Are we just talking about people saying mean things on the internet?
That is a great question, and I don't know the answer to that. I think one of the most frustrating things about the conversation that we've been having over the past, publicly over the past couple of years about this issue is that we haven't really defined those terms. And to the extent that social media companies like Twitter and Facebook try to define those terms, we found that they don't necessarily, take action in ways that make sense with the way that they've defined them or the policies that they've set out. There have been a couple of studies about harassment that have defined the term really broadly, and in doing so have found that, lo and behold, harassment against men and women happens in, very similar frequencies. So there was one study that Soraya was talking about last night that maybe you can talk about a little bit more, that was investigating harassment against public figures in the UK, and found that male celebrities got more vitriol on Twitter than female celebrities did, but the way that they defined harassment was any tweet directed at them that had a bad word in it, including boobs and stuff like that. So there's a real, lack of specificity there. And so I'm sort of hedging because I'm not giving you a really good definition, but it's, I think, one of the most important things for us to sort of decide on in order to make meaningful change. Soraya?
So that really is a huge problem. I think a lot of people think of cyber harassment, and the first thing that maybe comes to mind is bullying. And that's really not what we're talking about. I've spent about a year now developing a taxonomy of what we mean by harassment. And it falls into legal and illegal acts and includes extortion, impersonation, stalking, sustained sexual harassment. It really is a very wide spectrum of things, invasions of privacy. And I think what's difficult when we use a term like cyber harassment is capturing exactly the depth and seriousness of what we mean and the financial, emotional, psychological tolls that it can take on the people that are targeted, the impact it has on work, on school, on personal relationships, on emotional well-being. All of that needs to be captured in the language that we use to talk about harassment. And so with as much specificity as possible, when I write, for example, I provide details and explain exactly why this is either something that is illegal or not illegal, why it's in contravention of social media platforms' guidelines or not, which are not necessarily the same thing, because policies at social media companies may adhere to the law, but they also may have nothing to do with the law. And when we start talking about global issues, that becomes much more relevant. So I think that if we can move as writers to being more specific, using clearer language, and making those connections will help clarify some of the ambiguities that plague these surveys. Because the surveys, we need the data, and we don't have accurate data, really. So,
I think when I talk about harassment, it's very similar in the terms that Soraya uses as well. I think for us at Trollbusters, what we try to do is operate at that end of the spectrum where we're talking about bodily harm and economic damage. As journalists, our job and our work is both online and off. And when we are put in fear of our lives or put in fear of our bodies or our families, are put at risk through the language that comes through in this harassment, it has an economic impact as well as a psychological impact. And I think that's what we need to have people understand, that the recourse for us in terms of going dark or not participating fully and being expressive in ourselves online has an impact not only on our work, but on the safety of ourselves and our families. And I think that's the issue. And where we deal with things at Trollbusters is at that extreme end of the spectrum where somebody's life and or livelihood is at risk.
What interests me about the way that harassment is often spoken about is that the attitude when you first bring it up is always of not believing women. it's always of not believing people who are targeted by online harassment and saying, oh, well, harassment, you probably just mean people calling you a bitch or whatever that is, people calling you something vaguely mean. And I think it's important to get across that there is a huge problem with sustained and severe personal abuse, stalking, doxing, threats, but there is also a broad atmosphere of silencing and intimidation, which is part of the same culture. I mean, I think it's useful, I often find it useful to imagine it in the physical world, although there's not, you can't make that direct comparison between the internet as space and public space in the physical world. But just imagine if every time you left your house to go to work, you were followed down the street by people screaming sexual slurs at you, which is a reality for some women in some parts of the world, including in this country. And it's really important to understand that this is the atmosphere in which female journalists have to operate, many of us, and in which we have to do our work every day. And it has a real impact on our sense of physical safety, on our mental health, and our ability to continue working. There are emotional overheads. There is a huge overhead, a huge cost to doing this stuff every day.
I think one of the interesting things about discussing this at ONA and your point about women being believed is that women in media at least have this platform to publicize what's actually happening to them. But at the same time, a heightened profile, of course, spurs on additional abuse. Do you think that online harassment directed towards women in media is different from online harassment directed at any other woman?
I do. In my piece, I make some sort of ham-fisted comparisons between abuse that happens in an online public sphere that is perhaps analogous to catcalling, abuse that comes from an ex-boyfriend, an ex-partner, that's more analogous to intimate partner violence. And I think that we see all of these sort of traditional ways that women are oppressed, reinventing themselves online. And so journalists, I think, are in an interesting position because, of course, we can get any sort of intimate partner violence-based harassment, just like any other woman. But we also get this public-facing harassment, and it's really clear to explain to people, I think, how that type of harassment impacts our livelihoods and our jobs. So in a way, we are really helpful, I think, examples about, how harassment can affect women. At the same time, I think because female journalists, myself included, have been at the forefront of this conversation, it can obscure other, women who are experiencing this, other ways that they're experiencing this. And in some cases, I found with Twitter specifically, to the extent that they've tried to solve this problem, they often tried to solve it for the individual journalist, the individual celebrity, the individual Twitter power user. And so my, hope that journalists can serve as like an example and help push the issue forward doesn't always work.
Yes, I do think that we, as writers, because we're just in the public sphere, get a lot of attention. But I think that one of the issues we have as people who are targeted for abuse, who are writing about online harassment and writing about gendered violence in general, is that there's a prevailing tendency in media, as is the case with gendered violence overall, to focus on stranger crimes and anonymity. And I cannot stress enough how much we need to change that narrative, because we're going down the same path of obscuring the main issue here, which is that the kinds of harassment that most women, not necessarily us, but most women are experiencing, is being perpetrated by people they know. And even as journalists, we were talking about this last night, we are harassed by other journalists, and in some parts of the world work with women who are being harassed by their governments who are using sexual surveillance or who are using other forms of electronic media to suppress their voices. And so I think that we need to be really careful when we talk about this and write about this to keep in mind the vast majority of girls and women who don't have these kinds of platforms. I mean, we make a choice to be here today. Many women don't. They do this and they cede the public space, which is a huge problem. And I think all of us are here today because we know that there's nothing new about women being drummed out of public space. That's as old as time. But the degree to which we're able to use the internet to change that is unprecedented. And part of that is understanding the balance between the anonymous perpetrated crimes, which is a lot of things like really horrific name calling and sometimes very graphic threats, distinguishing that from the more insidious and persistent forms of harassment that use electronic tools.
I have a really interesting perspective because of my background as a print columnist back in the early 2000s and the work that I then subsequently did in online communities to today, where I agree, journalists can be trolls too. I've experienced that with my scholarship as well. But your question, Sarah, really spoke to, yes, as journalists and as people in the media, we have a platform. And yet, when I was at a newspaper writing as a columnist, as the very first African-American columnist in Florida, at the time, because we weren't on social media, we weren't promoting social media, Twitter and Facebook, et cetera, our columnists were the people who had their face in the newspaper. Reporters generally had a byline, but the columnists were the ones that were the face of the newspaper. And I received hate mail, physical hate mail, to the newspaper over the course of 3 years that talked about everything from how do you get an N out of a tree, cut the rope. There's going to be a race war against you, N people, and you're going to be a part of it. And comments like that were directed to me because of not necessarily my gender, but because of my race, and because I did have a voice in the newspaper. It wasn't a voice talking about online harassment, obviously. I was talking about general lifestyle things in my family. And the point I want to make is that I think we make this mistake of thinking that trolls are individuals out there doing this work. I believe there's concerted efforts by whether we call them hate groups, groups of power, misogynistic groups, whatever. In my case, I believe it was organized hate groups that have systematically gone after people of color and their voices in print and online in order to be able to silence us. And as long as we persist in the idea that trolls are the teenage boy that just doesn't have a great image of himself, and that's what they are, I think we're going to miss the point that this is a concerted effort by people to be able to shut down diverse voices in our media.
Yeah.
I think we have to understand, I actually began disguising myself, had the police patrolling my home. My kids had cell phones before anybody else because I wanted to know where they were at all times. And after 3 years, I could not, Sarah, talk about what was happening to me in my columns. I could not, out of fear for my family and fear for my life. And so just because I had a platform doesn't mean that I was willing to use it, because the terrorism that these groups inflict on you is very deep and very powerful and very real. And so literally after 3 years, I changing my roles, not working nights, trying to find ways to solve this. And the problem was I came to almost every single professional organization and asked, where are your conference sessions talking about this? Where are your programs to be able to support and protect journalists? You're talking about diversity in the media. You're bringing us in and we're going out the back door just as quickly as we're coming in the front, because we're scared to death and you have done nothing to protect us. My newspaper's solution when I had to walk out the door at night after working on the night news desk was to take a coworker with me to my car That was their solution for me to be safe against somebody with a gun that was coming after me. That's not a solution. That's not a way to be able to protect your people. I'm not in a war zone. I'm in my home talking about my family. I'm in my community trying to bring people together, which I think was the reason why I was targeted, because my columns talked about bridging culture and gender and age and people growing up and living together in a community safely. And that was more threatening than me coming right out and talking about racial issues, because what I was doing was subverting the conversation and using my intimate knowledge and my intimate moments of my life to show that we're all human. This is what we do. And so even though we have the platform, I don't think we have the ability in all cases to be able to use it. And it was very striking in that example because I had readers who had been reading me for several years. One day, one reader called me and said, I don't know what's happening, but I've been reading your column the past couple weeks. Something's going on. I want to know what's happening. And I explained to her the letters that I'd been receiving. And she offered her home as a safe house. That's the kind of impact I was able to have on my readers, but that's not a solution. And so take that to the online world, where I was a moderate online. One of the most powerful ways to be able to shut down this kind of voices is having strong moderation online. But when journalists themselves are the ones who are saying and invalidating you and slandering you and defaming you, where do you go to get recourse and voice for yourself in those situations? And I'm a journalist. And so what happens to ordinary women, people, young people online who are trying to make a difference and use this technology and are shut down? So while we have a platform, I don't know if we're free in all instances to use it in a way that might make a difference, except for now.
Laurie?
Yeah, this is an issue about power. And I think, so one of the things you're often told if you speak out about harassment and you are a female journalist, particularly a woman of color, is that, oh, well, you have this platform, so you asked for it. What did you expect? And I think that gets right to the root of the issue, in that this is about broad resentment of women who are perceived to have any sort of power, particularly in the media, particularly if we're considered to have leverage. There is resentment at that, including within the industry. And I would like to echo what Soraya said. I have also been harassed by other journalists, harassed by other publications. I mean, I come from the UK, where that's basically the way of doing business anyway. I mean, it's and it's particularly unbelievable that we still have the conversation about, oh, well, all trolls are just anonymous people in basements typing away, when our best-selling newspaper is the Daily Mail. This is it is a cultural problem, and I don't think it's just confined to the UK by any means. This is a freedom of speech issue. This is about freedom of speech for people who aren't white, cis, able-bodied, straight guys. Anybody else's freedom of speech is at risk online because of this stuff. This is a diversity issue. It is about how you promote and treasure the work of women and people of color. And most importantly, it is a labor issue. It is something that editors and papers and news outlets and media outlets have to get behind and understand that we are taking on more risk, and we are putting ourselves out there every day on what is seen, if not by us, then by the organized groups who are harassing us. It is seen as a culture war. And I think we have to, particularly those of us who are columnists, or who are kind of out there putting out opinions and fighting these battles, this is definitely, it feels like a fight every day. And in 2012, I wrote that a woman's opinion is the short skirt of the internet. The idea that if you have one, then and you flaunt it, and you flaunt your brain or your power or your opinion, then you deserve everything you get. And we need to turn around that opinion really extremely fast. Understand that this is first and foremost a labor issue and a free speech issue, and this is and the test for news organizations is going to be how they support people in the years to come, how they recognize this problem as serious.
I think something that's interesting is that as journalists, we're naturally partisans towards free speech. But at the same time, when we're looking at online harassment, one of the common tropes in the discussion is you have to choose between women's safety and free speech. And on top of that, I'm very struck by how social media is playing a very integral part in all of this. Dr. Verrier, you were part of this early wave where harassment was directed to you because you were a public figure in a newspaper. But now with the change in journalism, particularly digital journalism, we're all pressured to have an online presence, to be on social media, and to be public figures. And so what ends up happening is that the online harassment debate, when it comes to female journalists, is completely tied up with free speech on social media. Amanda, I thought it was really interesting that you wrote, when Chuck C. Johnson was banned on Twitter, you were one of the few voices that expressed concern about this move. And I think that's interesting too, because your essay on online harassment is one of the things that launched a cultural change in the discussion. Where does the role of free speech on social media?
So I think while I agree that cracking down on harassment is something that allows women and people of color and everyone else who is a marginalized voice to speak freely, I do think there are serious questions about what the line between harassment and journalism is. This is something that Gawker is dealing with now and deals with all the time, but specifically in the context of the lawsuit from Hulk Hogan, who has sued Gawker for airing a supercut of a sex tape that was recorded of him, with or without his consent, is an issue that will be, decided, I think, in the suit. And Gawker, is defending itself as a journalistic outlet that was reporting on an event about a public figure that was of, in the public interest. And others are framing Gawker as a revenge porn outlet. I tend to come down on the side that says that Gawker really shouldn't have published that sex tape, but that they shouldn't be shut down for doing so, because I think they do a lot of really important work, and some of the important work that they do is like helping us all decide what is acceptable for journalists to do. I think there are a lot of other ways that journalism, can look like harassment. Tabloid journalists who follow celebrities around are, often get in physical confrontations with them. There's a lot of, controversy over who owns the public space that a celebrity is walking down and how close someone can get to them. And I think those are legitimate questions that, we need to figure out what that line is. I think a lot of times it's clear, it is clear what is harassment. And sometimes, people like Chuck Johnson will specifically try to, I think I used the word slither in that piece. They'll slither that line between harassment and journalism in order to see what they can get away with and push Twitter's own rules around it. And while I don't value the quasi-journalism that he does, I do think it's really valuable to see how Twitter reacts to situations like that, because in many ways their policies are not clear. And the lines that they are drawing, allow for things that, can cloak themselves as journalism but feel harassing. And so just like journalists, I think, can sometimes be, really helpful examples of how harassment affects women, I think that quasi-journalists like Chuck Johnson can be really helpful examples of the deficiencies in policies in places like Twitter.
Soraya, you were one of the organizers of the Facebook rape campaign, which got Facebook to recognize misogynistic content as hate speech that was against their policies. So you have a lot of thoughts on this issue.
So I do. What we did with this campaign was, as a journalist, and both Jacqueline Friedman and Laura Bates, two other writers, and I were having the same experiences, where we were writing about these experiences, but then people started sending us their incidents of their own abuse. Basically, they had nowhere else to go. They couldn't go to the companies, and they couldn't go to law enforcement, because nobody really understood what this was. And when we were saying misogyny online in 2010, 2011, 2012, people would kind of glaze over, because they're thinking bullying, and that's for children. And so we came together, and we approached Facebook. I spent about 9 months talking to Facebook that didn't really yield any results. But what became really clear in the course of the 9 months was that law enforcement and social media companies have this dynamic relationship where they're looking to each other to see what the technology is doing and how the law is or isn't adapting. And users fall through those cracks. But in terms of free speech, what was clear was that in the assessment, whether it was in law enforcement or at social media companies, of what constitutes safety, what constitutes harm, what constitutes a true threat, is as normatively androcentric as virtually anything else. So when I, for example, or someone in our position would go to a company like Facebook and say, I got this cannibalistic, pornographic rape threat from a man who actually has my address and is sharing it, I feel threatened. This is in violation of your policies against harassment, bullying, hate speech, all of which they had in place. And they come back and say, we don't think that's a legitimate threat. There's a problem, right? Because I feel like it's a legitimate threat. She feels like it's a legitimate threat. And what about that equation is not legitimately harassment, bullying, or any number of other things? So we went back and forth, and then our campaign basically bypassed Facebook, and we went straight to advertisers, and we showed them screen captures of their ads next to a very narrowly defined set of things, geographic representations of rape and domestic violence. Now, our campaign actually was much broader than that, but the public-facing aspect was very clear-cut. And really, we had some horrible images that we couldn't share, and worked with people at the DART Center for Trauma Journalism, because these were awful images to inflict on people and very traumatic to process, things like beheadings and live rapes and being filmed. This is really awful stuff, and advertisers started dropping out. We're like, do you really want your brand sitting next to this ad, sitting next to this content? And all we were asking was that Facebook recognize violence against women as a legitimate form of hatred. We weren't asking them to change their guidelines. We weren't asking them to suppress other people's free speech. We were just saying, this is not a joke. You're treating it as a joke. As a matter of fact, there was a category called controversial humor that they would slap onto the content to eliminate any ambiguity that people might have about that. And so since then, we have a large coalition called the Safety and Free Speech Coalition, because we're very focused on making sure that people understand that for most of us, those two things are on the same side of the equation. The running mantra 4 or 5 years ago in Silicon Valley was, we need to balance women's safety and free speech, as though those two things are somehow in opposition and unrelated, which is just flatly false, right? And we've gotten to the point now where I think that's a very common refrain. You can hear it coming from Twitter, you can hear it coming from Reddit, you can hear it coming from Facebook, and that's a big change, that's a positive change. But we're still dealing with the core central issue that violence against women, gender nonconforming people, people of color, is somehow exceptional. It's marginalized. It's not centrally defining the problem that we have to deal with. And I think as journalists, we need to be thinking about what that means in our own institutions, because we still expect people to be personally responsible. It's the don't get raped model, you know, and we need to have institutional solutions in the law, in the tech companies, and in media companies, so that when an editor trying to develop diversity on a staff assigns stories, very often personal stories, right? Because we really love to get the personal narratives, particularly from women. there is a high disparate cost and impact to those stories, and there can be really horrible outcomes based on silly things like the word choice of headlines. A headline can derail my life for 2 weeks if it's not carefully thought about. And that may seem like a small thing, but it really isn't if you write every day, you know? So.
I think something that's interesting is that, you know, I think people tend to hyper-focus on taking down the content, taking down the content,
Yeah.
taking down the content, but that's, you know, there is no one-size-fits-all solution. And Michelle, I think it's like really interesting that what you're working on right now has to do with using technology, community moderation, and it's a counter-speech project. It's not about taking down bad speech, it's about flooding people with good speech.
Yeah, the Trollbusters project really came out of the experiences that I had many years ago. In fact, there was a project in between there called Spot Hate, where I was trying to work with the Southern Poverty Law Center to take their huge database of hate crimes across the US, as well as geo-source content from across the US to see if we could create a climate map of hate. That's where I was coming from after these experiences. I really wanted people to understand the impact and the pervasiveness of the conversation, and that this wasn't just something that was happening to me, that was happening across the country. And that project would have killed me, I think, if I had tried to continue dwelling in that. And when I went to the International Women's Media Foundation, where they had a summit this past January talking about women in the news and women news media makers and journalists, and what were some of the issues that we face trying to work both within and outside of media corporations to create our own platforms, I had to pitch an idea for the hackathon that looked at a way to be able to solve this problem. Trollbusters does use counter-narratives. Even though the name says Trollbusters, we don't go after the trolls directly. What we try and do is go after the targets of the harassment by providing a hedge of protection around them. Positive messaging, reinforcement, tips on what they can be doing right now to be able to protect themselves. We call it digital hygiene tips. And lessons so that people can protect themselves right now in terms of the impact, because as it continues and it grows, there's the short-term impact, which is this troll is bothering me, then the pile-on effect of other trolls coming in and doing that to where you can't do your work online. Then the issue of you trying to document that work so that you can send it to the platform or send it to law enforcement, and having to be able to then technologically keep your site up and running if you're under a DDoS attack, and protect yourself from the doxing that might be happening to you. So the impact immediately on somebody who's attacked like this is very, very severe and very, very crippling. And what people do is go dark. They go underground, they go offline, they stop talking, which is exactly what we don't want them to do. So kind of like the high school principal that would come stand in the classrooms where there were the troublemakers that were making trouble to keep them on check, Trollbusters goes into the tainted stream where the troll's operating when people tell us where that's happening, and we flood that stream with positive messages. There are generic positive messages in our prototype that we're using to test and see whether that counter-speech makes a difference. And then what we hope to do is build that, allowing for more personalized testimonials and other information, because there's a short-term emotional and very real effect, but there's also a long-term effect on women's reputation. We're talking about digital identity and reputation management. And in this day and age, as journalists that are online journalists, our digital identity and reputation is all we have. And so these kinds of comments persist online in search, and so when your name comes up, all this garbage comes up as well. Somebody says, whoa, I don't know if I want to deal with that person. Don't know why I want to give them that job. Don't know if I want to work with that freelancer because of the controversy that might come to my publication as a result of working with that person. And so what we see are the long-term effects on their reputation. So what we're using is technologies to be able to flood that stream with positive messages, help provide the hedge of protection, the eyes on the stream to help capture and archive what we're seeing so that we do have evidence that we can also use to support the reports of the target themselves, and be able to help them persist online and provide them with the resources to persist online in the face of these types of attacks. So technologically, over the years, we've tried online comments to try and open it up and create more voice. And I worked at a newspaper where it didn't matter. We'd have a story about an African-American family whose house had burned down. And inevitably, within 20 comments, it devolves into a racial issue where people are really piling on to a family who's just lost everything with more racial slurs and other things that they really don't need emotionally, now compounding the issue of what's happened to them. And so our solution has been to try and authenticate people, to make them more real by making them sign in by Facebook, by blocking people. Trolls will be trolls. They're human. It's part of our human condition. And so what we need to do is find solutions that are going to actually help mitigate the damage of what they do and help people persist online.
So I guess the one thing I would add is that this is, I want to come back to what Soraya said about the personal responsibility aspect and the question you always get, you know, how are you dealing with this? How are you going to manage this? When the last time I went to the police about somebody who'd sent me disgusting threats and physical threats, I was told, well, can't you just get off the internet? You know, wouldn't you just be safer if you just didn't use the internet? And I'm like, sure, probably. I would also have no job, and I wouldn't be able to talk to any of my friends, or like my mom, or really do anything apart from sit in my house by myself in my bed. And it's turning this back on women and what we're doing. Is a way of turning the issue around and making it as if, you know, we ask for this by being out there, and actually this is flatly untrue and needs to be turned around, because this is not about individual responsibility for harassment. I don't think this is about that at all. This is about how it is a labor issue. It is about how editors are going to protect their people, and how society in general understands the harassment of women and people of color, and anybody who is not a white cis straight guy. The idea of asking for it by being out there, I think it is really important to remember what that is about, right? We are often told that, you know, this is just how people are, this is just how the internet is, and that really confuses me, because there is no this is how it's always been on the internet. I mean, I remember before the internet, you know? I imagine most people in this room do, you know? There is no always on Twitter. You know, this stuff changes fast, and the idea that this will always be how women are treated in any kind of public space is up for debate right now. One of the reasons that this is happening is because the internet is a game changer, is because digital communication and digital speech is a game changer, particularly for people who have not traditionally had power in public space. There are vastly more women and people of color and young people and queer people making their voices heard online right now. It is a huge change in culture, and what we're seeing now is not just the everyday attacks, it's not just how it's always going to be, it is a backlash. It is a backlash to the power that marginalized voices are gaining. And if we want the trend to continue, whereby the internet is also a place where people's voices can be liberated and culture can change in this exciting, progressive, positive way, which I am thrilled to be a part of, both as a journalist and as a writer, as an advocate, then we need to get behind this. We need to fight the backlash, and we need to recognize that that is what it is, and it starts with our places of work, our editors, our employers, and our colleagues. And I would be shocked if there was nobody in this room who had not engaged in that backlash to some degree. And I would like to address those people directly and say, what the hell do you think you are doing?
I think that for women journalists, this isn't just, you know, a big cultural upheaval, it's a workplace hazard. Mm-hmm. What are some of the worst ways in which newsrooms and journalistic institutions have failed female journalists?
So the most sustained experience that I have had with stalking and harassment online was from another journalist. it was someone who, when I was a local reporter in Washington, D.C., he was a blogger for a DC-based blog and had started putting a bunch of rape jokes in his blog posts. And I wrote a piece about it that was remarkably measured. And I read the piece to him over the phone before I published it. And he didn't realize until it came out that the facts of the story were like very unflattering to him because he was a total asshole. And he got,
they don't recognize that.
Yeah. And instead of like thanking me for helping him realize this, he left a bunch of comments on our website. He sent me a bunch of emails. He called me on the phone, and he, threatened to rape and kill me. And I was working for a bunch of very lovely people who were really understanding, and they helped me do a variety of things. One was when the police tried to serve him papers because I tried to get a restraining order against him, and he wouldn't open the door. They paid for me to have a processing service deliver it to him, which is costly. For weeks and weeks, I didn't realize this when I first got a restraining order, that you have to, you can't just get a restraining order against someone. You have to demonstrate, by some civil standard that they have committed crimes against you. So I had to convince a judge that it was more likely than not that on several occasions he had threatened me physically, and on, the sum of those occasions added up to a stalking charge that, of course, the police wouldn't investigate, but that I could get this restraining order against him as like a consolation prize. And because there are so many people who are trying to get restraining orders in Washington, D.C., I had to go to court like day after day after day waiting for our little trial to happen. That was time that my employers let me take off. And those were things that, when I became a freelancer and I was experiencing harassment then, that I didn't have those luxuries because I was my own boss and I couldn't pay myself unless I, wrote every day. So I think it's something that, places should be aware of either, when they're employing people or especially when they're employing freelancers and they're putting them at such risk by publishing their stories, particularly, personal stories that a lot of online publications really love to publish, and that they, need to be aware that they might have to make an investment in protecting their writers if, something goes wrong. One thing that I think my workplace didn't necessarily take as seriously as I would have liked was the immediacy of the threat. So this person threatened not just me, but my editor. And he threatened me by saying, various sexist and homophobic things and threatening to rape me. He threatened my editor by threatening to tie him up and shit down his throat. Excuse my language. And that's like kind of funny. And I had this conversation with my editor, who is like a really fit guy, and he was like, I don't think that he can do that. Like, I don't think that he would be capable of doing that. And I think a lot of things that, one thing that publications don't necessarily understand is that these people could carry out their threats against journalists if they wanted to, and that many female journalists in newsrooms have experienced like the exact thing that they're being threatened with, and that can make the threat feel, more immediate and scarier. So if a female journalist who's working for you is being threatened with sexual assault, like, don't assume that that has never happened to her, because it, in one form or another, it probably has.
Yeah, I would say that if it's not evident already, rape is a theme. And one thing, I write for I freelance, and I write every week for different media, and there are a couple of very persistent themes. One is, as Amanda said, when a woman gets a rape threat, don't laugh it off. If most editors and most senior people in media management are men, and they tend to be white men, and even saying that feels aggressive to some people. It's just a descriptive statement of fact, right? And the chances that a man is raped is something like 1 in 77, but the chances that a woman has been raped is 1 in 5. Don't teach the controversy of the rape statistics. They're pretty firm, right? And the fact is that all of us know people who have been raped or have been raped. So trivializing that fact and the connection of the threats to our daily lives is really unhelpful, even if it's done as a way to make us feel better. Like, oh, you know, it's just online, right? The second thing is, language is really important. We're all writers and thinkers about words, and I would strongly urge media organizations to think hard about how they define obscenity, right? So we won't show pictures of topless women protesting Exxon in Nigeria because that's obscene. But when it comes to actually describing what we're experiencing, we can't use the right words to do that. And can I read something just to?
Yes.
It's not that I just want to be kind of salacious about this, but when I asked a lot of women writers and took some of my own examples. So this is what I might wake up to in the morning. You're a hole to be ejaculated into as your mother was. You either fulfill that role or you fail. You stupid cunt, if you try saying stop interrupting me, you'll get punched across the face. There was other messages describing serial killers that they particularly admire and why killing me would be a good practice, threatening to rape family members, or giving me a rapeability score. We can't write those in family-friendly ways. And not using the right language to describe what we're talking about hurts us. So when somebody says she received an obscene message, that's virtually useless in really conveying the impact of what we're talking about. And so I think that's very, very important. This is just my own personal gripe. I talk to a lot of men whose work I really respect, and they will say, that happens to me too, I get abused. And everybody is harassed online. If you're in the public sphere, you are harassed. But I would still argue that there's a big difference between someone saying you're an asshole and somebody hammering you all day with gendered, racial, sexualized slurs and threats. There's a qualitative difference in the experiences that we're having, particularly given our vulnerability to violence offline and our experiences with those things. And I think that the other thing I would say is I see a lot of conversations in the media that are kind of throwbacks to really retro, circa 1970s, 1980s free speech, feminist pornography conversations. We're not talking about that. We're really talking about a qualitatively, quantitatively different thing. And until we deal with the offline suppression of speech that results from violence against women and connect it to what we're talking about, we're not going to move very far because we are genuinely invested in liberating speech. When we're talking about these things, it's not that we want to just shut people up. We actually want to expand freedom of expression and freedom of speech. There are 200 million less girls and women online in the world today than men. And that's a combination of things related to poverty, access, education. But it's also substantively related to these very early stages in how we treat the internet and people on it. Because what we do now in this really foundational moment is going to have a butterfly effect for a long time.
I'm going to take a little different tack because I have talked about some of the specific things that my newspaper did or did not do. The gender of our students who are coming into journalism is changing. Our classes are 60, 70% women, so if you think this issue is not going to impact your newsroom, it will, because the people you're going to hire are going to be women, and they're going to experience this issue. If you think this issue is just here in the US, I recently traveled to India to programs there to talk to those women, and there were young women that wanted to become journalists, and their family flat out refused to let them do it because they were fearful for their lives. We cannot continue to call ourselves journalists when we don't have a system in place that allows for diverse voices, gendered voices, people of different ethnicities to be able to speak out on the issues that are important to them. And so if we don't look at this as an issue now, our journalism is going to become very flat, very one-sided, and very concentrated to the few voices that still have power, and the rest of us will be shut out of that conversation. So if we want to think about things to do right now, it's looking specifically at that nexus between law and law enforcement. Law enforcement not understanding the online space, not understanding what's possible, being dismissive, as they typically are with female crimes, not understanding the impact emotionally on a woman or her family, etc., not taking the threat seriously, requiring an inordinate amount of evidence to be able to demonstrate the impact on their lives. I literally had to change my career in order to be able to save my family and move them to another state, literally like under cover of darkness, to protect myself and save my tracks. Because as I said earlier, this is organized hate speech, people fighting power battles against diverse voices. This isn't just the one-off teenage troll in the basement. And so if we don't act as if this threat is something that is going to tear the very fabric of our democracy, if we as journalists don't fix this and understand the impact of it, we're going to see ripple effects for many, many years to come.
So we're running short on time, but I really wanted to get this last question in because we were talking about law enforcement. We've had a pretty US-centric focus. I do really appreciate that you have brought an international perspective in, but I think it's really interesting that all across the world, this debate about online harassment is erupting. Like, we had a report come out from the UN yesterday. The Organization for Cooperation and Security in Europe is really interested in this question as well. And when it comes down to it, though, in each country, even though they're having a debate about online harassment, it's a very different debate, because here we tend to talk about, for instance, oh, what are the police doing? Why don't they take our threats seriously? But in other countries, female journalists, their threat isn't, anonymous trolls, it's the government. And I have to also point out that here in the US, there are many female journalists who cannot go to the police for various reasons, for the topics that they cover. Perhaps they cover police brutality, perhaps they do exposés on police departments, perhaps they write for radical publications that are under surveillance or are being targeted. And perhaps they're women of color who come from communities that are very suspicious of the police. Like, aren't we doing some women journalists a disservice if we focus our attention on the law and law enforcement?
I think so. And, I'd go further and say that for all of us who write about online harassment, even going to Twitter, going to Facebook, or any of these other, non-governmental entities, when we also cover them, is like a really uncomfortable experience. So I do think that there are, there's like a real need for alternate solutions like what Michelle is doing. And maybe you guys can talk a little bit more about what those are.
I think, too, that it has to be a broad-based cultural, multidisciplinary approach. Law enforcement will never, ever solve this problem. Social media companies on their own cannot solve this problem. We have an empathy deficit in our country. We have an empathy deficit in general, but we have these huge cultural norms that are being uncovered and amplified because of the medium in ways that we've never had to deal with before. And so our approach in terms of the coalition that I work with, which is global and involves technology, law, academics, social media people, is to do that. It is to have multidisciplinary working groups that can come together in a very thoughtful way and try and be as productive as possible. Sometimes the law is in the way in a big way. Sometimes, obviously, profit is in the way in a big way. But there is, I will say on a positive note, because I would like to try and end on a positive note, that there is a huge change both in public awareness and in understanding between now and even 2011. And we need to capitalize on that. And we really need media to help frame this conversation in a productive way.
I think you're absolutely right in terms of the multifaceted approach. There is not an either or. It's not one solution. We've got to look strategically at all the different avenues we might be able to employ, and including good research from the academicians on what works, what could work potentially. And so hopefully we'll be able to do some of that with Trollbusters. I think when I look to the cultural shifts that are happening right now, journalists have to be in a place to be able to help elevate what's happening and showing the consequences of this kind of behavior. I think why this issue is getting attention, particularly and more forcefully in other countries, is that there are high-profile cases where the media is demonstrating and showing that there's a consequence to this behavior, not just that it's happening, but that there is some result both for the target as well as for the perpetrator. And so I think the media has a role to be able to play in helping to bring these stories to the fore and perhaps showing that there is some recourse for the target and that there's going to be some serious consequences for the perpetrator as well.
As a non-American journalist and writer, I think it is important to acknowledge that the conglomerates and the social media companies we're talking about are almost all American, and they bring American values in terms of whose free speech is more important, and they are spreading those across the world and expecting that to be the standard that everybody conforms to. I had an experience with Facebook recently where I used Facebook in a more private way, or I did. I was under a pseudonym, and in order to protect myself, my family, Facebook did not accept this and locked me out of my account until I sent in my legal name, and which actually wasn't the name they used, because it's not. They forced me to use my byline, which is not my legal name, and now I receive many more threats on Facebook than I did a couple of months ago. And just 2 days ago, I was approached by Facebook to be a verified user and to use their new news service, which is going to make me, and said, "Oh yeah, congratulations! You're going to be able to create more content." I'm like, "No, that's exactly what I didn't want. That's exactly what I didn't want. I wanted the space where I could talk to my mum and my cousins without being in fear of being sent daily rape and death threats, as I am on every other platform." And I think it is important to understand that women and people of color and any people who are marginalized in traditional media are not just content creators for you. We are human beings, and we need to be protected, and we need agency in those spaces. I do not wish to feel myself like I am forced to be putting out content all the time and to be forced to be in this public space. And I know there are people from Facebook here. I know there are people from Google here. And I think you need to think hard about what women are to you and what people of color are to you. Are we targets? Are we clickbait? Or are we users as well? You know, we are not just product. We are your users.
So we're out of time, unfortunately. I wish we could have talked for twice as long. I think that the conversation is just beginning, and I am so pleased that I could speak with you all today. Thank you.
Sarah.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.